My fascination with Peeping is that it satisfies my extreme curiosity about people. And photography, for me, is an extension of that. It allows me to be very curious and get into other people's lives. You know, you knock on someone's door and they let you in, and suddenly you can be extremely nosy. And I'm a very, very curious person, and photography satisfies that urge. In 2008, my wife received a job offer to come to Paris. As a family, we agreed that she would go back, and I was very unhappy with the decision because I'm not a great fan of Paris. Not that it's a wonderful city and it's culturally a very interesting city, but the urban landscape here hasn't changed in 100 years. In the beginning, I had no idea what I would do. The city had been photographed thousands, millions of times. It was full of cliches, and I just didn't have a clue. So I holed up in my room the first couple of weeks we arrived here. And at some point I thought, why don't I just look at Google Street View? It was quite new. Google Street View came online in 2007, so it was just online for 6 months or so. I decided to explore the city using the Street View platform. And one thing led to the next. I set up my camera and I started photographing certain scenes which I saw on the monitor. And it turned out to be a totally new way of looking at the city. The way I go about selecting images is very intuitive. I start at a street corner, and I proceed to go down several blocks, and I basically look at every square centimeter of a picture on the monitor. I try to look inside windows. I see if there are cars I can look into. I see if there are mirrors on cars where I can see something behind that car. I try to explore all the possibilities, and I'm not looking for anything specific, but if I see something which interests me, I photograph it. I've been asked many times, when does a Google Street View picture become a Michael Wolff picture? It becomes a Michael Wolff picture as soon as I determine how I crop the image. The Google Street View image is actually quite a total scene of the street, and I'm taking often tiny elements, a foot or a hand or a gesture. So for me, the cropping is the crux, is the crucial part. The aesthetics play a large role, the composition of the picture. There are millions of ways of cropping a situation, and it makes a difference if you crop off, if a picture is framed symmetrically, if it's an asymmetrical picture. There's so many ways of going about it, and each one is my own decision, and each one determines how the picture looks. And there are many stylistic elements one can play with, of course. It's possible to quote other people's pictures, which I did. There's a very famous picture by Robert Doisneau called The Kiss. And believe it or not, on Google Street View, there's also a couple which almost mimics Robert Doisneau's photograph. In this case, it's also cropped in the same way as Robert Doisneau's picture. It's a very classical crop. The kissing couple is in the middle. It's a very easy, readable picture, but this is done intentionally because what I wanted was for everyone who sees this picture to be immediately reminded of Robert Doisneau. Of course, in Paris, Cartier-Bresson photographed a lot here in the city, and occasionally I would try to imitate his decisive moment style. There are a few images which I have to in general, I just try to to crop in such a way that the picture is aesthetically interesting, and it should be something which makes you pay attention and look. Another topic I worked on parallel to Paris Street View, I called a series of unfortunate events, of heart attacks, of car accidents, people falling off bicycles, car fires. And I always wondered, how can it be that exactly at that moment when a car catches fire, is the Google Street View camera there, or people kissing? I mean, all these things. But then when you think about it, if you have 4 or 5 camera cars going through the streets of a city 8 hours a day, the chances of them capturing some extraordinary or unfortunate event are actually quite large. Here we're looking at one of my favorite pictures. It's a woman standing in front of a doorway, and she's smoking a cigarette. The door is opened behind her a crack, and there's a man standing there looking at her, and she doesn't realize that he's looking at her. And so the picture gets a very almost threatening feel to it, because you're not sure, is he going to grab her, or is he going to tap her on the shoulder and say, hey, it's time for you to come back in? Or perhaps he doesn't know her at all, and he's just going to go out the door and go shopping. So again, it's a picture which is very ambiguous in its meaning, but potentially there are a lot of interesting different interpretations. Well, I think the famous example is Hitchcock's Rear Window, where James Stewart is looking with his telephoto lens into the apartment across the road, and he thinks there's a murder being committed, but he never really sees the murder. It's just that someone picks up a knife, and in the next frame someone is dragging a sack out of the apartment, and if you add 1 and 1, that equals murder, equals 2, but it never really happened that way. And it's the same with this Google Street View project. There are a lot of images which suggest a story, but you're not quite sure what story it is. And those are the images which I'm interested in finding, because it just leaves a lot open for the imagination. The idea behind Transparent City was a fascination with architecture. The whole topic came after I had worked on architecture of density. If you know that work, it's extremely two-dimensional and about surface. These buildings are all, they look like supermarket barcodes basically from far away. And the idea behind it was that Hong Kong is very two-dimensional, and Chicago would become three-dimensional and more about looking into the buildings rather than the surface. This series is actually comprised of 3 different views. One is, of course, the total view of the architecture, and the second one is of the screen grabs, or of the pixelated crops out of these individual files. And then, of course, when the building I was standing on was close enough to the building opposite, I could, with a long telephoto lens, photograph individual windows. And I took some of these images into the book and into the show as well. The pixelated close-ups of the Transparent City project were a conceptual decision I made after I had photographed all the architectural shots. I remember looking through my material, and I was a bit unhappy with the simplicity of it. It was only facades and windows and looking in, and I remember going through these files and trying to clean them up a bit, retouching them, and I looked at them at 100%, and I suddenly was looking at one window where there was a man there giving me the finger like that, and I thought, oh my God, what a serendipitous moment. Let me do a crop of that. And it was a revelation when I saw the print, because you had this extremely pixelated picture, which when you were up close, you really could not see what it was. But if you went back 20 feet, you quite clearly saw what was going on. And with the architecture, it was exactly the opposite. The farther away you were, the less you could recognize, and the closer up you got, the more you could recognize in detail. So the whole concept also was about the medium of photography. And suddenly I had more than just a series of architecture pictures. And then I went from file to file, looking into windows. And that's, of course, this extremely voyeuristic moment again, where it's sort of like the Google Street View again, where I really went from window to window, because before I never really bothered to think about what's going on. And now I was seeing what is happening in all these windows and which window is worth it to do a crop. The difference between peeping and taking a picture, I think that's semantics. Every form of photography is some form of peeping or voyeurism. I would consider peeping an invasion of someone's privacy, for instance, more than taking a photograph of a landscape. Voyeurism can be harmless, but voyeurism can also be extremely harmful. So I think you always have to think about what you're doing. Is the photograph which I'm taking, if other people see it, are the people who are in that photograph going to be harmed in some way? And that's something you really have to take into consideration. 1715, so it must be up here on this side. There, I see it. It's the red awning. It's right behind that. Here's the electric box, and here's the drain pipe. I never really am able to make a completed concept before I begin something. I always have to start working, and then things develop, and I often change in the middle, change directions, or I think of another facet. I think what happens to some people before they start on a project, that they become overwhelmed by the possibilities of what one can do, and that's often a hindrance to go out and do something. The great thing about photography, especially nowadays, that it doesn't cost anything. You just go out with your digital camera and you start photographing, even if you're not sure what you're doing. When I started off with photography, I had a few role models. I loved Eugene Smith and his humanitarian view, and it was something which influenced me tremendously. And I copied him. I mean, the spirit of his pictures were really important. It took me many, many years to find my own voice, but I think that's an extremely long process, and to begin with, one always imitates. I'm just looking at the foam issue Peeping, and there's several topics here which I find very, very powerful. One of them is Tim Hetherington's Sleeping Soldiers. These sleeping soldiers I find very interesting, because this again is borderline between voyeurism in the sense that you're photographing your subject without them being aware of it. I'm not sure how comfortable I would feel if I knew someone were going to come into my room while I'm sleeping and take my picture. I think spontaneously I wouldn't feel comfortable. But in this case, I think the topic is so strong. It's images of sleeping soldiers who've obviously had a really rough time fighting a war, and at night they're exhausted. And I think we've seen enough images of the direct fighting. It's always interesting to see an interpretation of a situation from a totally different angle. And why do I want to see someone shooting his M16 or whatever for the 100th time, or a tank going down a road? It makes me think much more about a situation when I see a solution which an artist has arrived at, which is totally unexpected. you.